Hello everyone, and welcome back to Autonomia, the show where we bring ideas from the libertarian left to everyday people, and foster conversation on what we believe in hopes of proving that we all have far more in common than we are trained to believe. My name is Hayward, and I am your host. As always, our intro and outro music come from a song called A Bigger Cage is Still a Prison by System Failure. If you'd like to look up this song, the band spells System, C-I-S-T-E-M, for political reasons.
There's nothing I want more than to sleep under the night sky, hear the animals as they go about their lives, feel the fire warm my body, feel the mud under my toes, but tonight this cell keeps me enclosed.
Welcome back to the second part of our multi-part series breaking down the Prager U video contrasting the left from liberals. As I previously stated, the response to this Prager U video ended up being a lot longer than I expected, so I had to break it up into several sections to make it more digestible and more accessible to people that might be interested in hearing my opinions on this video. I'm not sure exactly how many parts this video may be broken into, simply because I have the raw audio recorded, but I haven't gone through the editing process to determine exactly what I might want to add and what I might want to remove, and how long those edited files will end up being. So it's entirely possible that this could be a 6-part mini-series. It's entirely possible this could be 4 parts. I'm not sure. But we'll find out as time goes on. And then eventually we will return to our standard question and answer based podcast that is sort of the main intention of what we're talking about here. So what will follow is the second part of the response to the Prager U video. You can find part 1 of the response to the Prager U video on the SoundCloud, or also you can find a link to it on our Facebook page, which is just our name, Autonomia. You may decide you want to do that because it sort of gives a bit of an intro as to what I'm hoping to achieve by dissecting and responding to the various points of this video. You may find that if you just listen to random sections of this, you might not have the full context as to what I'm going for here.
I want to climb over these rooftops and over these fences and escape to the places none of these guards would go.
As the video continues, Dennis goes on to bring up capitalism, which is of course critical when discussing this distinction between the left and the right. As you may have noticed in the second installment of our show, we described the political compass, and the left and right division is defined by the relationship to capitalism. So a leftist is going to be critical or even oppositional to capitalism. A liberal, as he points out, is pro-capitalist. They may want a higher amount of government intervention in the capitalist system, but they believe on some level that capitalism should be kept, reformed, or is useful or beneficial to society in general. That is not a leftist position. It has never been a leftist position, and by definition it never will be a leftist position to be pro-capitalism. And it is one of the key distinctions between liberals and leftists. Where Dennis and I start to disagree is where he starts to talk about capitalism having lifted more people out of poverty than any other system ever. It's a pretty common talking point, and it makes sense until you actually investigate it a bit more, like many talking points that we hear in the media. A person that exists in a subsistence lifestyle, who grows their food and lives off the land, is, yes, technically poor. And if you only view and measure the prosperity and quality of life through the amount of dollars that you have, then yeah, it's brought more people out of poverty. But what does it actually do? Was that person living an impoverished life, or did they live a life that they wanted and they wanted to defend? If we look through history, as capitalism metastasized around the world, it didn't happen because people just liked the idea. It was brought there by force and by violence. People were forced to go into the system, and people fought viciously against it because they didn't want to go along with it. This system was first started during the enclosures of England in the 17 and 1800s. They had to figure out a way to get people to go into the factories. So what did? They took the land from the peasants and said, hey, now you have to work. I know you've been farming for 20 generations and you take the entire winter off because it's not the growing season, but now I'm going to need you to work all year long, all day long, and, maybe lose a limb or three in some kind of nightmarish industrial equipment. Naturally, people didn't want to go along with that, so they used the power of the state to deprive them of the land, and by extension their ability to subsist outside of the system. The now landless group of people needed to eat somehow, and they were brought under this system. They were brought into capitalism because they needed to survive. They didn't join it because they wanted to, and there was a lot of resistance to it. But this happened all over the world. This system was brought to people by force. People didn't choose it. And if you look around the world, a lot of people aren't particularly happy with the system right now. So has it created and imposed the wage system on people, and in so doing, given them more money than they would have had before? Sure. Is that actually decreasing poverty? I certainly don't think so. You can very easily look around at those places where capitalism is being imposed upon today, where they're still in the process of enclosure, and you see people that were fully subsistent and fully happy with their lives being driven into factories, while the wealth that they used to enjoy locally gets shipped off to countries like ours, where we just like to pretend that everything's okay. So yeah, capitalism is not something leftists support, and we have a lot of reasons for not supporting capitalism, and those reasons come from a lot of different places. I strongly take issue with the idea, or the narrative that he's painting, where capitalism lifts people out of poverty and creates prosperity. It creates prosperity for some off of the bones of a lot more. What's unfortunate is that he frames this extremely faulty narrative about capitalism without ever engaging or even addressing any of the critiques of capitalism. He just says it as if it's an undisputed fact that capitalism is good and just is great for the world. And that's a belief that I find to be emblematic of a profoundly insular view of the world. I think a pro-capitalist view, and this is my opinion, only makes sense if you really, 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 really shelter yourself from what's been happening under capitalism. And in the first world, that's a lot easier to do. It's not something I'm going to blame someone for. If you exist in a system that constantly barrages you with its own propaganda and constantly hides its crimes, you're not likely to be critical of it. But perhaps over the next few minutes, as I provide some examples of reasons why someone might be critical, or at the very least skeptical of capitalism, you may find that you would share some of these concerns.
From the window, I hear the aching groaning wind. It forces its way through the cracks onto my skin. I long to climb out, to be swept up in its wrath, but I can't break through the bars that keep me in. There's nothing I want more than to sleep under the night sky, hear the animals as they go about their lives, feel the fire warm my body, feel the mud under my toes, but tonight this cell keeps me enclosed.
So when I talk about bringing up critiques of capitalism, we often act as if just because other economic systems have resulted in the deaths of people, that our system is without sin. And I think that's a really dangerous oversimplification that prevents us from having a fully formed and more nuanced view of the facts. The underlying dynamics of capitalism have killed an unfathomable amount of people, and depending on how you want to measure that, it easily eclipses even the most ambitious estimates for how many folks communism has killed. And I'm not going to sit there and defend that because, frankly, I'm not a communist. But I also know history. And I've also heard quite a few fairly convincing arguments that the numbers that we often hear repeated are rather shaky. And that's not to say that people weren't killed, because they were. Perhaps we can get into the more details of that on a future episode, or maybe I can link one in the comments, because there's some interesting stuff there. Apparently a lot of the claims for the commonly cited numbers can all be traced back to one guy. So, worth looking into, but maybe at a future date. So what do I mean when I talk about the underlying dynamics of capitalism killing lots of people? Well, if you think about the pursuit of profit, you might have to imagine that a lot of people have died as a result of the pursuit of profit, whether it be people being poisoned in rural America from fracking waste, or you can go to all of the mining disasters that have happened all throughout the country. Or even more directly, you can go to the private mercenary armies that were hired during the labor movement to massacre striking workers. A lot of violence has been done in the pursuit of profit. You might remember a few minutes ago when I mentioned the enclosures. I mean, you have to be aware that that didn't happen peacefully. This system can only be instituted on a place through pretty horrific violence, and that's something we shouldn't ignore, because a lot of people die to make this system the way it is right now. And unfortunately, those people's stories almost never get told. But there's a really interesting example that I would say to people that are very sympathetic toward capitalism, especially sort of an anarcho-capitalist or hyper-libertarian idea of capitalism. Because they often say that, any sort of regulations are burdensome and detrimental to business and therefore freedom. Well, you may or may not have heard of a place called Bhopal. Over in India, there was a plant owned by Union Carbide. Interestingly enough, almost as if perfectly laid out for a scientific comparison, they had a sister plant somewhere in America. I can't remember exactly where off the top of my head. And this plant manufactured chemicals for pesticides. And when the plant in Bhopal was first put there, they had all the same safety regulations and standards as the plant in America. But as time went on, it became unprofitable to maintain that level of safety standards. And because there weren't the same regulations in India as there were in America, they started cutting corners. Because more often than not, you have to seriously ask yourself, if a corporation isn't held to account, will they cut corners in the name of profit? And under the logic of capitalism, of course they would. And of course they do. The safety standards began to get so unbelievably laxed there that beyond just these highly toxic chemicals used to be kept in separate containers and refrigerated because you can then isolate the amount that would be released in any given leak. They moved it all into one container because that was cheaper, and they rerouted some of the coolant for AC units. Also, the pressure gauges stopped working. In fact, it was very common for the pressure gauges to read several times higher than normal, so much so that it was seen as unreliable. So if you had a wildly massive reading, you would be encouraged to disregard it. Over in America, where they were required to pay for sensors to check for gas leaks, in Bhopal, the method to determine if there was a gas leak was if your eyes are watering. So one night, I think it was in 1986, but I'll have to try to correct myself at some point in the future if that's off base. So in the 80s, quiet night in Bhopal, India, and there was a very high pressure in the tank. And they were trying to figure out what was going on, and their eyes were watering, and that tank blew up. And that tank leaked a heavier-than-air poison gas that was chemically similar to the poison gases used in World War I. What was downhill from the Union Carbide plant were the slums. And in one night, it's estimated that as many as 20,000 people died and as many as 40,000 in the long term. These people, entire families, were exposed to the type of gas that melts and liquefies your lungs. So when you talk about limiting the freedom of a corporation because you're regulating them, how about the people whose lungs got liquefied? How about the families that got destroyed? Did they not matter because they were peasants? You see, capitalism, when allowed to be its fully most honest self, murders people out of sheer convenience for its profit margin. Think about how you would react if you were woken up in the middle of the night by thick air that you couldn't breathe. Think about how you would react if you saw your child's eyes in absolute panic as their lungs melted right in front of you. Think of the helplessness they would feel, and the helplessness you would feel, because you can't do anything about it, because you're dying too. Think about if you went out that night to go get some groceries or go for a walk, and you come back and your entire family's died horrible, horrible deaths, because a company from the other side of the world sacrificed safety in the name of their profit and convenience. If something like that happened to you, you might understand how absolutely ruthless and inhumane the system can be when it's allowed to be. That's the danger with capitalism. That's why you have to worry about it. If companies aren't required to behave ethically and morally, they will behave based on what is profitable for them, which is why in America you had private mercenary armies machine gunning striking workers and their families. One of the first instances of air combat in America were people hand-dropping aerial bombs from biplanes on striking miners. And of course, nowadays it would seem unbelievable for a company to literally be dropping bombs on their workers, but that's because we have regulations to stop capitalism from being its fully most savage, most brutal self. But there are still places in the world where this type of thing happens. You can also tie together the idea of enclosures with the ecologically devastating effects of capitalism when you talk about the island of Bougainville. There was a mine there, a copper mine, owned by a foreign company that was stripping the place for profit. A bunch of people lived there and were not particularly thrilled about the idea of their whole ecosystem being poisoned for the profit of a company that had nothing to do with them. But the company certainly didn't care because they weren't required to care and they had no financial incentive to care. The people that lived in Bougainville weren't really buying a lot of the material. It was being shipped off to the first world where they could get as much money as they could for it. Eventually, these people decided that they had had enough, and they began to rise up. Not only did the company have a means of resisting these people, but the military of, I think it's owned by Papua New Guinea, were fighting these people. And eventually they were able to successfully kick the company out. But there's this meme that circulates online a lot of the times that says, you can vote your way into socialism, but you have to shoot your way out. Which is kind of ironic because you can't vote your way into capitalism. It is forced on you, and you have to shoot your way out in order to get out of it. Every time people democratically elect a socialist government, you saw this all throughout the second half of the 20th century. If they didn't have some sort of internal divisions that made them collapse, usually they had some mysterious circumstances that led to their collapse. And the people that elected those governments resisted the collapse because usually they were done by external forces. You can think about Chile as a great example. They democratically elected a leader there who was not agreeable to the American agenda. And so on September 11th, ironically, they overthrew this guy, and they installed a general called Augusto Pinochet. This guy was now a bit of a meme on the alt-right, but he, among other things, distinguished himself by his right-wing death squads. You might see the hashtag RWDS patches on certain members of the alt-right, and that's what it's referencing, just for a little factual tidbit for you. So the Caravan of Death was where Augusto Pinochet had his followers use suspiciously American-made helicopters to pick up dissidents and throw them out of them. So that sort of extrajudicial killing of any sort of resistors is the kind of thing that you see when capitalism is reimposed. And that's not to say that people weren't killed under socialism, communism, or whatever. However, you can't act as if our system isn't also nightmarishly brutal. Another example of the sort of ruthlessness and danger of unrestrained capitalism is the lead up to World War I. People started to figure out as technology was advancing that you could sell weapons on an industrial scale. And a few folks started to explore this territory, but they didn't really do it on a multinational scale until a guy came along who said, you know what would work really well? If we sold weapons to one side of a regional rivalry, and then talked to the other country and said, hey, these people have a new weapon, you should buy those too. And that ended up happening all throughout late 1800s and early 1900s Europe. They had a completely artificially engineered arms race, and people were making an unbelievable amount of money. What you ended up with eventually was a continent that was so overflowing with fancy new weaponry that a conflict was almost inevitable. And when that conflict happened, there were people that were making an ungodly amount of money on selling weapons to both sides. There were people in World War I that were using the same weapons against each other. And you know, it's not unrealistic to think that there isn't still a tremendous amount of war profiteering happening today. It's probably just a little bit less sloppy than it used to be because we've passed laws to prevent that. But if capitalism is allowed to be what capitalism is on its own, that's probably what you're going to see again. So an interesting example of the really savage and completely treacherous nature of capitalism and large capitalist industry is good old Standard Oil. And of course, their entire violent history during the labor movement aside, there's sort of an interesting time right around World War II. MIT has a small article on this, and I will link it in the show notes, which are currently only available on our Facebook page, which you can find under the same name as this podcast. Anyway, I'm going to read a little bit from it now. After the war began in Europe, the English became angry